This is Teaching Young Children with Dr. Marianne Modica.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here in a second. Hold on 1 minute. There's always that little awkward silence as you're sharing, but here we are. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks so much for attending tonight, and thank you, Judy, for giving me the opportunity to share tonight. So I'm Marianne Modica, I'll say an old friend of Judy's, because it's true in a couple of different ways. But we met when, believe it or not, I was a teenager when we met. Just barely a teenager. So it's been a very long time. And I'm originally from our home church, which is back in Queens. But I've been now teaching at the University of Valley Forge in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, in the education department for many years. And actually, for the past several years, I've been the chair of the education department. Okay, so let's get started. Someone once said that to teach is to touch a life forever. And I think, nowhere is this more true than in the church, right? In the church, we're tasked not only with teaching kids information, but with also helping them to develop a foundational relationship with the Lord that hopefully is going to stay with them through eternity. So the goal of our session today is for me to help equip you with just some foundational knowledge that will help you in your teaching young children in order to help them develop this foundation of biblical principles that are going to then stay with them. So what I'm going to teach you today is similar to some of the things that I actually teach in my early childhood education classes at the University of Valley Forge, but applied more to a church setting. All right, so let's start with the basics at the beginning. I want you to imagine something with me for a minute, okay? Imagine that you are in need of financial advice. Maybe you're getting ready to retire, or you're saving up for your kids' college education, or maybe you want to take out a mortgage or a home equity loan or something like that, right? So you go to a financial planner, but the problem is he or she speaks to you as if you just got your MBA from the Harvard Business School, right? Everything the financial planner says to you is true and important, but he or she doesn't say it in a way and actually understand. Now, most likely, you're not going to be too happy about this, and you're going to go elsewhere for your financial advice. So in the same way, when we begin trying to learn how to teach young children, we have to be sure that we are teaching them on their developmental level. And so we have to consider what's called developmentally appropriate practice. This is kind of foundational in the world of early childhood education. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at how we can create a basic lesson plan using a very basic format that also considers the developmental levels of young children. Okay, so as I said before, what I'm going to teach you is a basic lesson plan format, very similar to what teachers actually use in the public school setting. I did change it a little bit because I like food a lot. What I did was I kind of adapted the model with terminology that makes it easy to remember. So tonight we're going to talk about the big idea of your lesson, and then the actual three basic parts of the lesson plan: the appetizer or the motivation section, the main course or the development section, and the dessert, my favorite part of the meal, or the conclusion or application. Okay, so those are the parts of the lesson that we're going to think about. So let's start with the big idea. The big idea is kind of like your main concept or theme that you're trying to get across. Kind of like the way, so a lesson is like a good meal. So kind of like, a really fancy meal has a theme, not necessarily what, I put on the table every night for my family. But if you go to a nice restaurant and you're having kind of a a fancier meal, there's a theme to it, right? It's French, or it's Italian, or it's Asian, or fusion, or whatever, right? So the big idea is our main concept of our lesson. What do we want the children to come away with when the lesson is over. The big idea is conceptual, right? It's not necessarily factual. Now, facts are important. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on tonight. But underlying those facts, there should be kind of a main concept, something that we want the kids to remember. Like if you don't remember anything else, this is your takeaway of the lesson, right? This is what you're going to remember. So I'll give you an example. Suppose you're going to teach a lesson or you're preparing a lesson about the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Jesus teaches his disciples through this parable. What would be a possible big idea or main concept of the parable of the Good Samaritan? So if you're teaching very young children, your big idea might be something very simple, like Jesus wants us to help others, right? Simple, right? Straightforward. If your kids are a little bit older, your big idea might be Jesus wants people from all backgrounds to be kind or to help one another. So now we're getting a little bit more into it, right? If you were teaching older kids or even adults, and by the way, everything that I'm teaching you tonight can be applied to any age, from 2-year-olds all the way up through adults, these kind of main components. So if I were teaching older kids or adults the parable of the Good Samaritan, my big idea might be being religious isn't enough. Jesus wants us to act out our faith, right? Because who were the people that passed by the person in need? It was the religious people, right? It was the priest and the Levite who didn't help. Who did help was the Good Samaritan. Okay, but so anyway, the bottom line here is that you have in your mind a main concept, a big idea that is going to be that you're going to hit on throughout the whole lesson and really throughout your whole time with the kids. So from when the minute they walk in the door till the minute they leave when your class is over, this is your big idea of your session. Okay, so far you've kind of created a foundation, but you haven't done anything yet, right? Now let's move into the actual parts of the lesson plan that you're going to actually prepare. So the first part, as I said before, is our appetizer, also known as the motivation section, because this part of the lesson asks us, what are we going to do to engage or motivate children's interests? Sometimes in different types of curriculum, you might see this called the hook, right? This is the hook. Even a good sermon has a hook, right? How am I going to get kids interested? But this part of our appetizer also serves not only to get their interest, but also to relate the teaching that's coming to something that the children already know. We want to place the coming lesson, the learning of the lesson, within the children's field of experience. What do they already know about? And this is because a general learning principle says that all of us, children and adults as well, whenever we're learning something new, we do this better if we can relate it to something we already know. Okay, so if I'm going to cook something, for the first time, maybe I can relate it to something I've cooked. Oh, it's just like when I made this, except now I'm going to add this to it, right? So this is basically the way our brains like to work. When we're learning something new, our brains are searching for something to relate it to. So we want our appetizer or our motivation section to do that, to motivate interest, but also to relate what's coming to something that our children already know. Now, your motivation section can be lots of different things. This is where you can be creative. You can start with a question that then leads into a little conversation or discussion. You might show the children a picture and then discuss with them what's happening in the picture. It can be a brief anecdote or a sharing of a little experience, something that happened to you. It can be a little role play that you can kind of do with another person or with a puppet or something like that. Be whatever you want, but remember, it needs to be brief and it needs to not only get the kids interested, but relate what is coming. The appetizer is getting us ready for the main course, right? So we want to relate what's coming to something that the learner already knows. So let's go back to my example of the teaching a lesson on the parable of the Good Samaritan. I might begin by telling the children a little story or a little anecdote about how I was once helped by a stranger. Maybe my car broke down and a stranger stopped, pulled over, and helped me get my car up and running. Maybe I would ask them if they can remember a time when someone helped them when they needed help. So, but it can be whatever you want, but remember, just the way you don't want to eat too much of the appetizer because it's going to spoil, right, your appetite for the main course. This should be brief because we know that children have a short attention span. We don't want to use up their attention span, right, for on the appetizer. We want to save room for the main course and, of course, for the dessert. Okay, so once I've done that, I've motivated them in some way, and I've related what's coming to something that they already know, and then going to transition into the next part of my lesson, which is my main course. And I do this with a simple transition statement. Something like, well, just like this person helped me when I needed help, today we're going to hear a story that Jesus told about someone who was a very good helper. And then I transition into my main course, my also known as the development section. The reason it's called the development section is because this is where I develop the main body of learning. This is where most of my information is going to be. So just like when you were a kid and you learned how to write a friendly letter and you had like a little, the salutation, then you had the body of your letter. This is the body of your lesson plan. This is where most of your information is going to be conveyed. And because children tend to really love stories and relate well to stories, it's most likely that your main course is going to center on a Bible story. In a little bit, we're going to talk about why that's true. Why do children love stories so much? But before we do that, I want to take a little bit of a parenthesis here. And I want to talk about some developmental characteristics of children in order to make not only our main course, but everything we do during our lesson and during our time with the kids developmentally appropriate. We have to know something about the developmental levels of young children. So here's where we're going to really focus on that young age group. Young children really say up through kindergarten is considered kind of early childhood. So let's think a little bit about their developmental levels. And if you have your handout, if you didn't get the handout, it's in chat. You can download it from there. It's fine to follow along because there's more information on the handout than there is on the PowerPoint. Okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we need to know about children's developmental levels, starting with their physical development. We know that children's fine motor skills are still developing. Now, what do I mean by fine motor skills? This is referring to basically their hands, right? What children do with their hands. So their grasp, the ability. You ever notice how young kids, sometimes they'll hold a pencil or a marker, a crayon like this, right? Or they don't quite have the grasp yet. It also refers to their coordination, being able to coordinate their hand movements. Their muscle strength is not fully developed yet. And also something called hand-eye coordination, which refers to when my brain tells my hand what to do, right? I'm looking at something, I want to do it, but my hand doesn't exactly do what my brain is telling them to do yet, right? These things are still developing. So what does this mean? It means that any kind of activities we do with the kids, whether they be art or some kind of a craft, they should not require the handling of small objects, accurate cutting. For example, we give out kids a picture of Bible characters and we want them to cut them out. And it's like, oops, I just cut Jesus's head off. Like, now what do I do? Now, they can't do that. They can't. Cutting is a hard skill. If you work with young kids, you might know that. So just make sure that everything you do, especially when it comes to the area of art, is open-ended and something that children can do, on their developmental level. Remember that in early childhood, process is more important than product, right? The process of actually doing the activity is more important to them than bringing home a beautiful, adult made product, right? So we want to have activities that the children can do. Children, at the same time that their fine motor, their hands are developing, they're also developing their large motor groups, which refers to their arm and leg muscles. And because of this, they really need to move around. much more so than an adult who's already kind of fully developed in this area. So we want to incorporate opportunities for physical activity into our lesson. Make sure you give them lots of opportunity to move. And you can do that through action songs or movements, games, anything that gets them moving is good. We want to avoid requiring children to sit for prolonged periods of time. And at the same time that we want to keep them active, we also have to keep in mind that children will experience these great big bursts of energy, but then all of a sudden their energy levels will drop. These high bursts of energy will be followed by low energy, which is why you'll see them. They're kind of running around and they seem so active and almost hyper. And then all of a sudden they kind of just flop over in their chairs, right? Because all of a sudden now they're low energy. So this means that although it's important to keep them active, we want to alternate high levels of activity with times of quiet. It's okay then after they've been active, have them come, sit down. Now it's time to listen to a story or, do something quiet. So make sure that we're alternating those things. Let's think a little bit now about children's cognitive or intellectual development. Now, the word cognitive comes from the word cognition, which means thinking, right? So how do children think? Well, it turns out that children's thinking is very different than the way adults think. There's kind of a famous saying in the world of early childhood that says that children are least like adults in how they think, but most like adults in how they feel. And sometimes we have that kind of backwards. We expect young children to think the way we think, to kind of think logically and understand the consequences of their actions. And we're like, well, didn't you know? Well, no, they didn't know because they don't think the way we think, but they do feel the way we feel. So just the way if somebody says something, harsh or insensitive to us, it hurts our feelings, it hurts their feelings too. So remember, children are least like adults in the way they think, but most like adults in the way they feel. So how do they think? Well, what are some characteristics of children's thinking that we can keep in mind? One thing is that children are concrete and not abstract thinkers. Concrete meaning that children have to have real, specific material examples, real world examples to relate to in order to understand what you're trying to say. So children are concrete and not abstract thinkers. So we want to avoid abstract concepts, such as teaching children something like the Trinity, right? So what could be more abstract than the Trinity, right? I'm not sure that I understand the Trinity. I mean, I'll be transparent with you, right? It's a very abstract idea, but yet we try to teach it to children with object lessons like, the Trinity is like an egg. I don't know if any of you have ever heard this, right? So an egg has three parts: the yolk and the white and the shell. And so is the Trinity. That's how God. Well, you know what? When you tell young children that the Trinity is like an egg, they picture God up in heaven making scrambled eggs. They have no idea what you're talking about. So we want to stay away from that and keep it, real. This is one of the reasons that Bible stories work. Children are also literal thinkers. So if you say to a child, "Oh, it's raining cats and dogs," they'll go running to the window and they'll say, "I want a puppy. I want a kitten." But because they are literal and concrete thinkers, this is why they relate so well to Bible stories, because stories are like, they tell us real things that happen to people. It's something that we can relate to. So stay away from some of the more abstract concepts in the Bible. Save that for, I'd say, junior high is when kids start really thinking abstractly, and stick to the biblical principles that we can learn through the stories in the Bible. The other thing about children's thinking, and I've kind of mentioned this before, is that facts are important when we are learning something, but concepts are more important than facts. So for example, it's great if I can name all 12 apostles, but it's even better if I have a deep understanding of why Jesus chose these 12 flawed, commonplace individuals to carry his message to the world. That's something that can take root in my heart, because I'm a flawed, commonplace individual, right? If I forget an apostle's name, I can look it up. That's easy, right? But the concept is what's really going to stay with us. And then in terms of children's social and emotional development, we know that children learn from us and from each other, and often they learn by what they see, right? They learn by what they see us do, not necessarily by what we say. So it's really important to model a kind, caring, loving community. Um, in terms of the way we treat children, but also in terms of the way we insist that children treat each other. So that if children are being kind of mean to each other or unkind, it's our job to, gently correct that and encourage them, to be friendly. This is a friendly place. We're brothers and sisters here. Okay, so keeping all these developmental factors in mind, let's go back and talk just for a minute about that main course, right? So, what do we have to think about? We're preparing our Bible story. What should we keep in mind? Well, just some tips and ideas to keep in mind. It's really, really good. I'm sure you probably, if you've taught children, you're probably already doing this and you know this, but it's very important to use illustrations or visuals. And this is because our brains are very kind of wired toward visuals. We're a very visual society, first of all, more so now than we ever were in the past. Look what we're doing right now. We're staring at a screen, right? This is what we do all day. But it's also true that our brain, our visual brain receptors, those parts of our brain that kind of process visual information, outnumber auditory brain receptors by 30 to 1. So our visual brain receptors outnumber auditory brain receptors, the brain receptors that just kind of deal with what we hear. Our visual brain receptors outnumber them by 30 to 1. So we are wired for visuals. It's important and we should use them. We can also use role play or drama. I'm glad that I guess most of you are attending the session on using the creative arts in your lesson planning, because you're learning some really good techniques. And we want to use these. Of course, puppets are still great. We can be using props to help us tell a story. A fun thing that I read about is use props and then mix in other props that weren't actually for the story, and see if the kids can tell you which props stay with the story, which props don't belong in the story, and etc. And in your handout, at the very bottom of the last page, I actually listed some websites and resources that I've kind of vetted that have some very good ideas. So there's lots of places to find good ideas, but make sure when you're looking for them, they are developmentally appropriate, because now you know about developmentally appropriate practice. Not everything you find in books or online are going to be developmentally appropriate for young children. So make sure you check that out. Okay, then looking at our last part of lesson plan, which is our dessert. And I call it that because the sweetest part of the lesson is when we see children actually practicing what they have learned. Another principle of learning says that we haven't, all of us, even adults, haven't really learned something until we're able to use it, to apply it to our lives in some way. And so in this part of the lesson, we want to guide children in actually applying that biblical concept, our big idea that we talked about. Now, when I taught Sunday school, years ago, we had something which we called the application story. Maybe some of you will be familiar with that. So we would tell the Bible story, and then maybe we'd have a craft or a snack or something, and then we'd sit the kids down and we'd tell them another story that was kind of a modern day story, right? About how a child, something happened and they applied these understandings. That is not what I'm talking about today. In the application or the dessert part of our lesson, the children actually do something. They are not sitting and listening to us. They've sat and they've listened to us enough already. Now they are active. They are doing something, but that something they do applies what they just learned about. So, for example, if I were to go back to my Bible story about the Good Samaritan, I want them to apply the understanding that Jesus wants us to help each other, right? So I'm going to maybe think about an art activity, for example. Maybe they make something to give to somebody in need, right? So maybe they make a card as a way of helping somebody. Or maybe they draw a picture that shows them helping somebody or ways that they can help people in need. But you see, they're doing something to apply it. Or maybe you play a game or a role play where they act out something that they're going to do to help someone. Or maybe they're drawing a picture that they're going to give to their parents that shows how they're going to be a good helper this week. So, etc. Right? You can use your imagination. But remember that they're doing something during this time of in the lesson. Okay, so now because I'm going to practice what I preach, we're going to, in a minute or two, we're going to divide you up into groups, and we're going to give you an opportunity to kind of generate or brainstorm some ideas that you might want to use, incorporating them into these specific parts of the lesson plan. So I'm going to give you a different Bible story. We're going to get away from the Good Samaritan, and we're going to consider or think about the Bible story, Jesus feeds the multitudes. So this is John chapter 6, 1 through 14. And you probably know the story. I don't want you to take the time to look it up and read it. I'll give you the facts of the story. Basically, Jesus is teaching a crowd of people, and he decides that they're getting hungry. It's time for them to eat. The disciples, who never actually, kind of got it right, they were very confused lots of the time. They protest and they tell Jesus, we have to send these people home. We don't have enough food to feed all these people. So Jesus, though, takes the lunch of a young boy, 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, and he multiplies that small amount of food and he feeds the crowd. And not only does everybody eat, but when they're finished, there are actually 12 baskets of leftovers, right? So you know the story. I'll give you the big idea behind the story. Our big idea is that Jesus cares about our needs and he's able to meet them in ways that we can't even imagine. Okay? That's the big idea. All right. So then we're going to divide you into groups. How many groups are we going to have, Judy? 4 groups. Okay. And so here's what we're going to do. She's going to divide you in a minute. So you're going to see a message. I don't know if you've ever been gone into groups in Zoom before, but the way it works is that it's going to give you a message and it'll tell you what number. It'll tell you if you're in group 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? Now, this would be a good opportunity to take a little screenshot of this or a picture of it with your phone so that you don't forget what your group is supposed to do. If you're in group 1, you're going to come up with an idea or more than one idea if you have time for the appetizer, right? What are you going to do that engages students and relates what's coming, the story about Jesus feeding the multitude, to something they already know? This is the very beginning of your lesson. So group 1 is going to prepare the appetizer. Group 2 is going to prepare the main course, but you're going to think specifically about keeping children's physical needs in mind. So as you get ready to tell your Bible story, what are you going to do in that telling of your story that's going to keep the physical needs that we talked about? So refer to your handout if you forget, right? We talked about fine motor, large motor, and alternating active and passive during the lesson, right? So that's group 2. Group 3, you're also going to think about the main course, the development section, but you are going to tell us some ideas of how you would keep children's thinking, right? The way children think or their cognitive development in mind as you prepare the Bible story. You're not going to prepare the whole thing. Just give us some ideas, right? Some brief ideas. And then group 4, you're the lucky ones that get the big piece of chocolate cake. You're going to prepare an activity that encourages children to practice the concepts they've learned. So let me give you an idea about that, right? If our big idea is that Jesus cares about my needs, what am I going to do? How am I going to practice that as a child, right? Maybe I'm going to think of a way, or you're going to prepare a way where the kids are going to tell Jesus their needs. They're going to, draw a picture of or write them out or something like that. Or you're going to prepare something where the children can practice, how will I tell others that Jesus cares about my needs? Does that make sense? Okay, so what will the children do because they learned that Jesus cares about my needs and will meet them in ways that I can't even imagine? All right. So
Okay, you'll
giving
have
is,
about 5 or 6 minutes.
yeah,
Okay,
about 6
in
minutes,
your
and you will
groups.
get a message that tells you it's time to come back to the big group,
Okay,
and it'll give you a 60-second warning. So you don't have to like stop mid-sentence. You know, you can finish your sentence, but then you'll get a countdown, so you'll know it's time to come back.
okay. I'm putting them in groups now. Okay.
Go.
Okay, they should be,
And they disappear.
okay, and I just started the timer.
Good, because that's the thing we
Okay.
forgot last time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Welcome back.
Fun. Okay, is everybody back?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right,
For-
so let's hear from the groups and just, briefly what ideas you came up with. So group one, let's hear about your appetizer.
Marcy, you want to go?
Sure. So it was Claudia and I and Rachel, and then
Rachel.
for sure. And then so we looked at a couple things, right? We thought large group and small group. So for our large group activity, we said we wanted to invoke some activity level with it. So we said we would either play like a game of Pictionary, where you're doing some drawing, or we would do like big on a screen, rapid fire pictures. If kids like them, they stand up, they rub their bellies, they sit back down. If they don't like it, they stay seated. Small group, we could do things, put different types of foods in paper bags, and they would have to feel it, see if they could figure out what it was. And then we would do a big reveal around the group and then kind of lead into the lesson.
Okay, so how does that relate to, explain to us how that relates, and I could see where you're going, but you're relating the lesson to something that they already know. How would you take those ideas and do that?
Yeah. So I mentioned that I would like, to the first step will be something like, I'm hungry, or like, I want to eat something, like just taking it one step back and then talk about food, and then added like the games or the Pictionary or the lesson. So we prepare for the lesson that is going to be about feeding, because the feeding is going to be related to food for them.
Okay, so you're going to start by saying that you're hungry, and then so then whatever you do, it's related to the fact that you're hungry.
Yeah.
Pictures of the Pictionary. Okay, good. So you're kind of softening them up, right?
Yep.
Getting them ready to think about, well, I'm going to tell you a story now about some other people who were hungry too,
Mhm.
and what happened when they were hungry. Good, great, good job. Okay, how about group two? You're talking about our main course, and you're keeping children's physical development in mind. What would you do during the main course?
So that was Corinne, Nancy, and I. And please add if I forget anything that we talked about. So basically we were saying that, well, the last thing we talked about was doing like a 3-step teaching, where the first step would be to just go through the story, the telling of the story. The second step would be like maybe possibly like doing a craft where they create like maybe some of the props, for instance, like drawing or coloring fish and bread, and maybe making a basket, a construction paper basket or something like that, like creating like some sort of artwork props. And then the third step would be to have the kids reenact the story that they heard with the props.
Okay. And so you're going to keep their physical needs in mind by keeping them active, passive, right? So they're listening, then they're active, right? Then they're doing something with it. And whatever they create, those props are going to be developmentally appropriate, that activity. They're not going to be doing something that's too hard for them. Well, here's a rule of thumb. If you need a glue gun, it's not early childhood. I mean, then it's just not appropriate. Save that for, the VBS, the older kids or the youth or something like that. All right, good. How about group 3? You're telling us how you're preparing your main course, and you're going to keep those factors that we mentioned about the way children think in mind.
So that was Courtney and myself. And we talked about maybe either using flannelgrams or the Jesus Storybook Bible, which is my favorite children's Bible, and retelling the story to them, emphasizing the facts of the story of what the facts that we want them to take away. About one, as they talked about with the appetizer, like being very hungry, the people were very hungry. Jesus really loved them and cared for them. And so there was a little boy in the story, and just taking the key elements of the story that they can understand. And as we retell the story again, that they can take away the specifics that we want them to get, overall concept, and not all the tiny little specific details, but overall
Right.
concept. And
Yeah.
it really all comes down to Jesus really caring and loving for them.
Good. And so you're keeping it very concrete, right? Because you're not trying to, go abstract on them, but you're telling them something that happened to people that is similar to something that they can relate to. So you're keeping it concrete and literal. Good. How about our dessert people? What did you guys come up with?
So that ended up being me and Suzanne after I was teleported out of group 1.
Funny how that works, huh?
So yeah, we were trying to think, because they are with young children, we can't necessarily have them doing higher level service project type things, but we did think, you could prepare ahead of time and find out some needs maybe within the church, and maybe have them bring a donation specifically for that week, and also spend some time praying for that need, and have them write a note maybe to that family, and just emphasizing, how we bring what we can, and God uses it to bless others and meet the need. So,
Good.
And
yeah.
And I thought maybe we could,
Good. So
Go ahead, Suzanne.
Yeah, go ahead.
I had thought of
Go ahead,
telling
Suzanne.
stories about how my children had prayed for things that were hard to answer, and how God amazingly answered some of their prayer requests and encouraged them to trust God for, and then we kind of went off of that to us doing the possible and God doing the impossible, and adding on to bringing money to help, that maybe we could get some matching funds from people or from parents, that if they brought, $1, that the parent might give $1 or $2, and so how it could multiply and then have more than you started with to help the need, whatever the need was.
Mhm. Great. Yeah, so you have a lot of good ideas there. And so children, firstly, if I understand that God wants to meet my needs, then maybe we can lead them in expressing our needs. What are your needs? What do you need? And maybe we can create a poster or, something that they're actually doing to talk about their own needs. And then how are they helping? I really like those ideas about, sharing with others in need by maybe giving, writing a note to them, drawing a picture for them, something like that as well. And the multiplying, that's a really nice touch. So you bring a little bit and God then multiplies it through other people. So
Yeah.
good. All right. So it seems like you guys really got the idea. I think we have a little bit of time left. Judy, maybe we can just open it up now for general questions that you might have for either me or for Judy.
Yeah,
It
sure,
doesn't have
we
to
could
be
do that.
specifically about this, but other things as well. If they're on your mind, feel free to ask.
Yeah, and then at 8:50, 8:50. And
That's right.
I don't even know what time it is, but we'll close. And then whoever wants to stay can stay and ask more questions. But now we'll open it up for everybody for questions or comments.
You probably get this all the time right now, but how are you handling the activity aspect with COVID kind of constrictions on classrooms? Like, what are some suggestions? Because we're planning to start reopening our in-person in May.
Yeah. Well, so what the schools are doing is masks, you know, when all this started, everybody was saying, oh, kids can never wear masks. Maybe some of you saw those things that were going around Facebook of like what will happen with kids wearing masks, you know, like sneezing into them. But I'll tell you, they're fine. They're even really young kids are fine with it. And they have to be, you can't do everything you used to do. They are going to have to be socially distant. So spreading out your furniture, you know what I mean, in order to keep kids far apart, or if you have them on the floor, you know, you're going to have to mark the carpet with tape or something. It's not going to be, you know, you won't be able to do it all the time, but as much as possible, you're going to have to try to keep up with those very same guidelines that we're all using. And of course, you know, lots of hand sanitizer, the eating of snack. I'm not sure how churches are handling that. Whether they're foregoing it or because, you know, you're giving out food, kids are eating together. That means the masks have to come off. So that would mean they really have to be far away from each other. And, you know, you, of course, as a teacher, have to protect yourself, right? Because we know adults are way more vulnerable than kids. So you got to be really careful, you know, to follow those guidelines.
So you would say like the social activities are still okay as long as they're wearing a mask, like games and things like
As long
that?
as they're wearing a mask and they're not on top of each other. Now the guideline is 3 feet apart, I think, in the classroom.
Yeah. it
Which
is.
May
makes
depend
sense.
on where you're located and what age group. So I'm in New Jersey. It seems like there's different regulations and stipulations for
Yeah.
preschool versus K through 12 age.
Mhm. Well, I'm just going by the CDC guidelines, you know.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Marcia.
no, and the problem with that is the contact tracing is still 6 feet.
Yeah, you know, you're right. There's no easy answers.
I know,
No
it's
easy answers.
tricky.
But, you know, the schools are doing it here and they're doing pretty well with it,
Mhm.
but they're being ultra careful. And, you know, sometimes the churches aren't as careful as the schools are with stuff like this. So we have to be really vigilant. You know, we can't let our guards down yet. It's not over yet. You know, we're getting better, but it's not over yet. In fact, the numbers are going up from what I hear. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but so we do have to be careful.
And maybe if there's, Rachel, if you have public school or private school teachers or administrators that are part of your congregation, you might actually have those conversations with them
Mhm,
and figuring out what the schools are doing around you.
mhm.
Rachel, we have been doing in-person services for the children, and we have, when they come downstairs, we are a small church, so we have no more than 10 kids on Sundays. So we have the water bottles and the snack, they are the pre-packaged, so we don't have any,
Mhm.
you know, the people always want to bring like banana bread and all these things that they like, brownies, and no, we are not taking anything like that, just prepackaged in water. So as they go in the area where we have for kid church, they take the little bag and the water and they go, and we have the seats like really spread out for them. And then for the lesson, I have the chairs separated too. But the kids, they like, you know, it's just a lot of redirection every time that they try to get closer. It's just that kind of like, you know, just reminding them that they need to be separated and keeping the mask on.
Mhm.
We do have a family that they don't believe in the mask, and it's really hard because if you give the okay for one family, everybody else is going to do it. So
Right, yeah.
just to keep it, you know, it is what it is. All the other churches in my town, they are not opening kids church yet. We are the only one. So it just, we need just to follow the guideline, that's it. But there are ways if you don't have a big church.
Okay, I'm gonna just make sure everybody knows it's 10 of, and we're officially over. But if you want to stay and keep talking, because that's how we are sometimes, Marianne and I are here. But thank you so much for coming and joining us. I hope to see you next Monday. There's more workshops to come. I think we're still 4 weeks out. We still have 4 more weeks of this. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Thanks for
Unless you're
coming.
staying, but otherwise.
Thank you for coming.
Okay, more questions or thoughts?
I wanted to ask a question. Object lessons, like a little science experiment or something, is that too hard for them to understand?
Well, they're not going to get out of it what you're trying to, you know what I mean, what you think.
Like if you relate it to the story somehow, like adding the Holy Spirit is like adding the salt or something, is that too hard a
Yes,
concept?
you know, I mean, it's very abstract,
Okay,
right? And so, I mean, will they enjoy it? Yeah. Is it the worst thing in the world? No. But will they really understand what you're trying to get at? Probably not. And, you know, an
Okay.
interesting thing to do is to ask them after and see what they say. One time, I was teaching preschool and I was telling the story of the prodigal son, right? And I was actually following a curriculum, and the curriculum had written in it, this is a published curriculum, to ask the children at the end of the story, how is the father in the story of the prodigal son like God? Because that's what it's about, right? It's an allegory kind of, right? So how is the father like God? You know what they said? They both wore robes. They both have beards. Didn't get it. Totally. And I just laughed and I thought, okay, yeah, they totally didn't get it. So you can do it if you want, but don't expect them to understand what you're getting at.
No, they
They will
enjoy
probably
it.
have fun playing
They
with the
do, because
materials. Yeah.
it's all hands-on stuff. It's just
So
that
it's
sometimes I
fun.
wonder if it's really worth it.
They're not understanding what you're trying to get at. There's no doubt about that. Or most
Oh.
of them. I also don't like to make sweeping statements because kids are at different developmental levels. You know what I mean? So not every 5-year-old is the same. So you might have some that do kind of get it, but probably most of them are not going to.
Will not. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Dr.
Okay,
Modica, I had a question about mixed age groups. We're a small church, and our kids' church basically is 3 to 11. And currently we have the youngest is 3, and the oldest that's attending in-person church is 9. So what I go back and forth depending on the lesson as far as, okay, am I teaching more to the younger kids or am I teaching more to the older kids? Do you have any suggestions for managing that and making sure none of the kids are getting left out?
Well, I mean, we actually had this question on Saturday when we did the session. This is really hard. That's not an ideal situation, but I understand it is what it is, and you might not be able to change it, at least not right now. What usually happens, and I'm sure Judy can speak to this as well, is that you're going to probably aim for the middle, right? It's probably where your teaching is going to fall. So the younger kids are, maybe getting parts of things, but maybe not everything. The problem is really the older kids may wind up being bored.
Yeah.
So one idea is to make them your helpers. You know what I mean? So that then they can kind of pair off with younger kids and help them. And that actually teaches them something else. It teaches them how to give, how to be a leader. So that's kind of one idea. Judy, you had some ideas on Saturday. Would you want to address?
Well, I said the same thing. I shoot for the middle, but I don't hope that the older kids and younger kids get it. I do some things that I make sure the older kids and the younger kids get something. And so the older kids will roll their eyes at whatever I'm doing for the little kids, and the little kids will just be looking around when I do something for the big kids.
Yeah.
But I do shoot for the middle because I've worked with a large age range all my life, and so that's what I do. I do like the idea that Marianne gave about having the older kids help the younger kids. I used to have teenagers or older children that wanted to volunteer to work in children's church, and the parents would say no, you should be in church. And I said, why so what? So they want to get out of church to come down and work in children's church. It's fine. They're learning something and they're doing something. they're
Mhm.
walking away with a lesson in their head. So I didn't care what the reason was, that they didn't want to sit in a pew and listen to the pastor. I say, yeah, I'll take them. I'm not kidding, you know?
Because
Because I
they can
know,
still learn something from it, right?
They're probably
absolutely,
learning more, honestly. They're probably learning more because, you know, the adult sermon is really not going to be on their level, you know. I
right,
mean,
at
I would
all.
assume, you know, and it's
Right.
too long. Just even
Yeah.
thinking about attention, it's probably too long for adults. Honestly, if we're being
I
honest,
know.
it's too
Tell
long
me
for
about it.
my husband, who's a minister. He goes crazy when he hears a sermon over 20, 25 minutes. He says, if you can't say it in 25 minutes, you know, then you got a problem because we're only paying attention for 20 of those minutes anyway. We're not. We're thinking about dinner. We're thinking about, right? So,
I'm not giving it away. I'm not condemning myself to say that I'm thinking about other things.
No.
No, I'm thinking about every word the pastor says.
Right. Well, you've
I'm
always
kidding.
been, you know, more spiritual, Julie.
I've always
You
been
know,
a
what can I
liar.
say? You've always been, you know. I'm just a little, you know, little peon. You know. Anyway, what
No,
other
I'm
questions?
just a liar.
Just a big liar, right?
Yeah, so
Okay.
that's the only thing that I can offer. And there are things that you can do. And then I don't know if you remember me saying this in another session, the 5-minute rule. Like I change things up every 5 minutes, even sometimes you know, like shorter amounts of time. So this keeps everybody active, and the sit and stand and do and sit and move and I'm saying the same thing 20 times in the hour, but in different ways. You know, the same message, but different ways, and yeah.
Yeah, I'm
5-minute
trying
rule.
to perfect my craft in that sense because there are some weeks that it's great. And yes, you know, like changing it up every couple minutes,
Right.
it really helps with the younger kids. And then there are some weeks where, oh my gosh, that 3-year-old is not having it.
Well, you know, it's
So,
hard.
but you know, that's
hard.
what you gotta do. What do you expect out of a 3-year-old? So
Right. And are you alone with this group?
I typically sometimes, but that's not the ideal. So typically I will have actually a teenager with me. And so that is helpful, very helpful, especially even just when it comes to managing, you know, doing whatever project we're doing or
Right.
transitioning from one thing to the next. So that is helpful. But
you can use those teenagers, like you can break the 3 to 5 off and ask this teenager, like, but you'd have to prepare and work with the teenager. So it's not like you're throwing them in with the 3 to 5-year-olds. But you know, they can break off and do something different that's more age appropriate. So
true,
that's a thought.
because we do have a space that has the partition, so they could go where they're not technically on their own, you know, where I'm
Right.
still in eye shot and earshot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So there's things you can
that's
do.
something to think about too.
Right.
Other questions?
No? Are we saying goodbye now? You just don't want to
Thank you.
leave, do you?
Thank you. Did
Thank
you say
you.
there was another class about creative art?
Well, we had an art class last week. By the way,
Oh.
all these workshops are on YouTube. You have to put in Judy Mensch, Reach and Teach, and then they'll
Oh,
all come up.
okay.
And but we're also having another one about using video is next week, using video for your kids. And also we're having a drama workshop on how to
Oh,
start a
okay.
drama team. So
All right.
little
Thank
bit
you very
everywhere.
much. Have
You're
a good
welcome.
night.
All right.
too.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.